Picture a school cafeteria right in the middle of the day.
Okay.
But we're not talking about today, obviously. We are stepping back into, well, the absolute depths of the Great Depression. So right around 1936.
Right. A very different landscape.
Exactly. And I want you to really visualize the sensory details of this scene. You have a child, and they're slowly shuffling down a cafeteria line, sliding a tray along those, those metal rails.
Yeah, the classic institutional setup.
Right. The room smells like institutional soup and maybe floor wax. And standing on the other side of that counter is a worker from the Works Progress Administration, the WPA.
Mm-hmm.
And this is someone most likely a woman who was previously working in domestic service or maybe a garment factory. And just a few short weeks ago, she was standing in a municipal relief line herself.
Just completely out of options.
Entirely. Desperate for work. And now she is wearing a clean apron, she is holding a ladle, and she is scooping a hot, steaming portion of food onto this child's plate.
It is, it's such a profound image to start with, because you have two completely different ends of an unprecedented economic crisis meeting right there at the serving line.
Yeah, literally across the counter.
Exactly. The destitute worker and the hungry child just intersecting through this one piece of federal policy.
And the stark reality here, the thing we are pulling from the historical dossiers we are diving into today, is this. For a great many of these children sliding those trays along the rails, that hot plate of food the WPA worker just handed them is the only full meal they are going to get all day.
Wow.
That is their entire daily caloric intake, right there on that tray.
Which really forces you to sit with the gravity of what was happening inside these local school buildings. I mean, the level of systemic deprivation in the 1930s meant that the school wasn't just, a place of learning anymore.
No, not at all.
It was essentially the last line of defense against clinical starvation.
And then we have to pull back and look at this massive historical surprise hiding right behind that ladle of food. Because today, we are looking at a huge stack of historical records.
We really are. We've got dossiers from the Social Welfare History Project, primary records from the National Archives, and some brilliant New Deal scholarship.
Right. And our mission for this deep dive is to unpack a paradox. We're going to explore how a massive jobs program, the WPA, which was designed purely to put people to work.
Just a jobs program. Yeah.
Right. How it accidentally became the United States' first national social welfare agency.
It remains, honestly, one of the most remarkable instances of unintended consequences in American history, because nobody in Washington set out to build a national welfare agency.
That wasn't the goal.
Not at all. That was not the blueprint on the drafting table. The legislative mandate was strictly about employment. But the outcome, driven by the sheer reality of who was actually unemployed, it became this massive ecosystem of care.
Yeah. So if you are listening to this right now, especially if you are a teacher who has ever wondered where the modern programs in your school actually came from.
Oh, absolutely.
Or, if you are a parent whose kids rely on school lunches today, this deep dive is definitely for you. Because we are going to trace the roots of the exact programs your children use right now, straight back to this very moment in the 1930s.
It's a direct line.
It really is. Okay, let's unpack this. How do we get from a desperate need for jobs to a completely unplanned national safety net?
Well, to understand the mechanics of that leap, we kind of have to look at the defining rule of the WPA when it was created in 1935.
Okay, lay it out for us.
The mandate was incredibly straightforward on paper. Put one worker per needy household back to work by hiring them directly off the relief rolls.
Just one per household.
Right, one breadwinner.
Yeah.
The government had millions of people who were unemployed, and the goal was simply to give them a security wage.
A security...
Yeah, basically a paycheck large enough to prevent starvation, but small enough so it wouldn't compete with the private sector.
Oh, I see. So they didn't want people staying on the WPA forever if there were private jobs available.
Exactly. It was supposed to be emergency relief.
Well, I was looking at the demographic breakdowns in these National Archive files, and the crucial detail here is who those people actually were.
Right.
Because, the cultural memory of the WPA is always guys in flat caps digging ditches.
Sure. Or pouring concrete for the Hoover Dam.
Yeah.
Building a local post office, laying bricks. We immediately think of hard physical labor. But the relief rolls weren't just this, undifferentiated mass of construction workers.
No, not even close. You have to remember the Depression completely leveled the economy across all sectors. I mean, municipalities were going bankrupt everywhere.
Right, the cities ran out of money.
Exactly. Which meant cities were firing their public health nurses, their kindergarten teachers, their librarians.
And private wealth dried up too, meaning domestic servants, cooks, and caretakers were suddenly out on the street. So the people standing in those relief lines, a huge portion of them were highly skilled service and care professionals.
Who had just been completely thrown out of work.
Exactly.
So the government has this rigid bureaucratic rule, right? We have to hire these people off the rolls. But you can't just take a public health nurse or like a high school English teacher and tell them to go lay bricks.
Right? It doesn't work.
I mean, from a pure efficiency standpoint, the government realized handing a shovel to a librarian doesn't yield a very good ditch.
It doesn't. And it also violates their core philosophy of preserving human capital. That is actually the exact logical mechanism that created this accidental welfare state.
Tell me more about that, the logical mechanism.
Well, to employ someone to justify giving them that federal paycheck, you have to assign them a task.
Yeah.
That's the fundamental equation of labor, right?
Yeah.
If you hire a mason, the task is building a wall, and the output is infrastructure. But if your workforce is suddenly flooded with service and care professionals, and you assign them tasks that utilize their actual skills.
The work they produce is inherently going to be care.
Precisely. The output is care.
So it's like trying to build a construction company, but half the people who show up looking for work are doctors and chefs. You can't hand a shovel to a nurse and expect a bridge, so you end up accidentally opening a hospital.
That analogy perfectly captures the systemic pivot. The government was absorbing surplus labor, but the specific type of surplus labor dictated the output of the program.
Right.
And this brings us to the core philosophy of Harry Hopkins. He was the administrator of the WPA.
Yeah, Hopkins is all over these dossiers. He's a fascinating, almost combative figure in all of this.
He really was. He was a former social worker from Iowa who essentially became the architect of the New Deal's relief efforts.
And he had this governing instinct that seemed to drive the entire ethos of the WPA, completely cutting through the bureaucratic red tape.
Oh, absolutely. He famously operated on the logic that, and this is a quote, "People don't eat in the long run, they eat every day."
They eat every day. That's such a powerful guiding principle.
It was. While classical economists in Washington were debating these, long-term recovery models and waiting for the market to correct itself.
Hopkins was focused on the immediate, visceral reality of starvation.
Exactly. He had zero patience for theoretical delays. And he was completely adamant about who deserved this relief. He insisted that white-collar and service workers, quote, have got to eat just like other people.
So he just flat out refused to accept the prevailing idea that federal work relief should only be for manual laborers.
He completely rejected it.
But I want to introduce a bit of friction here regarding the historical record.
Okay, let's hear it.
Because if Hopkins is deliberately insisting that we have to hire the teachers and the nurses, and we have to let them do the work they are trained for, calling it an accidental welfare state feels a bit paradoxical, doesn't it?
How so?
Well, it sounds like they knew exactly who they were hiring and what they were doing.
Ah, right. The dossiers clarify this nuance beautifully, though. The origin was a completely unplanned, emergent property of the relief rolls.
Meaning they didn't see it coming when they wrote the law?
Right. When the WPA was legislated by Congress, the architects were thinking about employment broadly. They were definitely not sitting in a committee room drafting a blueprint for a national school lunch program.
Or a sprawling network of rural health clinics.
Exactly. The legislation essentially just said, hire the unemployed. The revelation of just how many service workers were unemployed and the subsequent realization of what happened when you put them to work. That was the structural surprise.
Okay, I get it. So the legislation was just a blank check for wages, not a blueprint for specific social services.
Precisely.
The clinics and the cafeterias just materialized from the bottom up, based on the skills of the people who showed up to claim the check.
Yes, but here's the key shift. Once Hopkins and the WPA administrators saw these programs taking shape organically.
Once they saw what was happening on the ground.
Right. Once they saw the clinics opening and the lunches being served, they deliberately embraced and expanded them.
They leaned into it.
Heavy lean. They saw the undeniable impact on communities, and they institutionalized the logistics to support it. So the seed was accidental, blown in by the winds of the economic crisis, but the cultivation of that seed was heavily managed from the top.
Which represents a massive paradigm shift in American governance. I mean, if you look at what the federal government considered its responsibility up to that point, the idea of public works was strictly physical.
very tangible things.
Yeah, roads, bridges, tunnels, things you can drive a truck over or sail a ship under.
Right.
But suddenly, because of this mandate to just get people working, the very definition of federal work expands. It shifts from purely structural infrastructure to human infrastructure.
That is the exact shift.
The idea that care is a valid form of federal work was completely revolutionary at the time.
It was unprecedented.
Yeah.
The federal government had never directly provided community services on this scale. It completely redefined the social contract, showing what a government could practically do for its citizens on a daily basis.
And once the WPA realized they had this massive army of cooks, domestic workers, and seamstresses on their payroll, they had to figure out the logistics of where to put them to work.
Because you can't have thousands of cooks sitting in a federal office building.
Exactly. They needed kitchens. And that logistical challenge leads us directly to the most famous, the most lasting legacy of this entire beautiful accident, the school cafeteria.
The sheer scale of the cafeteria operation is, honestly, it's almost difficult to comprehend without looking at the raw data.
It really is.
We are talking about unemployed workers being mobilized and put into school cafeterias across the entire nation.
Let's bring in the numbers from the sources because they are staggering. Over the life of the WPA program, so from 1935 to 1943, these workers served roughly 500 million hot school lunches. 500 million.
What the primary sources reveal is just this rapid explosion of the program. We have different snapshots from the records that measure different windows of time, but they all point to an unprecedented mobilization.
Give us an example.
Well, for instance, at its peak in the late 1930s, the program was serving on the order of 500,000 hot meals a day. And that was across roughly 10,000 different schools.
500,000 hot meals every single day.
Okay.
And the dossiers include an early contemporary tally showing the explosive start. In just an 18-month window, relatively early in the program, they served roughly 80 million meals to about 1 million undernourished children.
The logistics of achieving that volume, especially in an era before modern computerized supply chains, is fascinating.
Right. There were no spreadsheets.
None. And the WPA couldn't achieve this in a vacuum. It wasn't as simple as federal workers just marching into a local school, commandeering the kitchen, and starting to boil water.
Right, because education in the United States is fiercely local. The federal government can't just seize a school building. The local boards would have fought that tooth and nail.
Oh, there would have been a massive political backlash.
So how did they negotiate that entry? How did they get into the schools?
It required a very specific structural partnership. For the WPA to operate a school lunch program, it had to be sponsored by a tax-supported public body.
Okay, so who was that usually?
In almost all cases, this meant the local Board of Education or sometimes a really robust local PTA.
Got it.
And the local board had a specific contractual responsibility. They had to provide the physical space, the kitchen, the cafeteria facilities, the pots and pans, and they usually provided some of the raw food or materials.
And the federal government?
The federal government, through the WPA, provided the labor.
The cooks, the servers, the dishwashers, the human engine of the cafeteria.
Exactly.
And I was reading that the food itself often came from a mix of local donations and the Federal Surplus Relief Corporation.
Yes, that was a huge component.
So the government was buying up excess agricultural products to keep farm prices stable, right? Things like surplus apples, navy beans, canned pork.
Right, to help the farmers.
And then funneling those directly into these local kitchens for the WPA workers to cook.
It was a highly synergistic system. They were solving the agricultural crisis and the labor crisis simultaneously, and then funneling the outputs of both directly into the bellies of hungry children.
It's brilliant. And for the teachers and the parents listening right now, this is the exact visible skeleton of how school services operate today.
That local federal partnership.
Yes. Your local school district owns the building, they run the logistics, but they are receiving federal subsidies, surplus commodities, and federal frameworks to actually make the meals happen. The blueprint for that entire system was drawn up in these WPA negotiations in the late 1930s.
It is the absolute architectural foundation of the modern school nutrition landscape. The federal labor, matched with local sponsorship, created a template that proved local schools and the federal government could collaborate.
And they could deliver daily welfare to children without violating the boundaries of local educational control. But I want to bring us back down from the policy level for a second. Because 500 million meals is a statistic. A local federal partnership is a bureaucratic mechanism.
Right. It's easy to lose the human element.
Exactly. Let's re-anchor to that child in the cafeteria we talked about at the beginning.
It is essential to keep that sensory human element at the forefront of this history.
Behind every single one of those 500 million statistics was the daily personal experience of a hungry child receiving a hot plate of food. Think about the dignity restored in that exchange.
Absolutely.
The child gets the sustenance they desperately need to survive the day and, actually focus on their education.
And the person handing it to them.
Right. The person who woke up at 5 a.m. to prep those navy beans is someone who just weeks prior was unemployed, terrified about their own survival, and has now been given a purpose, a paycheck, and the ability to feed the next generation.
It is a perfect closed loop of human need meeting human capability.
It really is.
And for about 1 million undernourished children, as that one 18-month tally highlights, it was a literal lifeline. Teachers at the time reported that children who had been lethargic, falling asleep at their desks, or chronically absent.
They were suddenly attentive.
Attentive, energetic, and capable of learning. It wasn't just a convenience, it was a fundamental intervention in their physical and cognitive development.
But here is where the story naturally expands. Because a hot lunch does wonders, but it doesn't cure an infection, right? And it doesn't prevent a disease.
No, nutrition is only one part of the puzzle.
You can give a child a hot meal, but if they have rickets or are exposed to diphtheria, that food isn't going to save them. And the dossiers show that these lunch programs actually served as diagnostic hubs.
Yes, that's a crucial point.
WPA cooks and teachers were suddenly looking at hundreds of kids every day and realizing, wow, these children are profoundly sick.
The sheer concentration of children in these feeding programs made the underlying public health crisis completely undeniable.
You couldn't ignore it once they were all in one room.
Exactly. And because the WPA had pulled unemployed public health nurses off the relief lines, they had the exact workforce needed to address it.
Which is just incredible timing.
It really is. This is where the WPA expands from a nutrition program into what was effectively a shadow public health system.
The sources show they didn't just stick to the cafeterias either. The WPA began running nursery schools and childcare programs as well, correct?
Yes, they did. They set up roughly 1,500 nursery schools nationwide.
Wow.
It gave relief families and working families a safe, structured place for their young children during the day, which allowed the parents to seek work.
Which was vital.
Right. And simultaneously, it gave unemployed early childhood teachers a classroom and a curriculum to teach.
So it solves two problems at once again. But the medical side is perhaps even more striking to me. How did these unemployed nurses actually deliver health care in a country that had no infrastructure for it?
To fully grasp the impact of this, you really have to understand the medical landscape of the United States in the 1930s.
Okay, paint that picture for us.
Well, we did not have a national health service. What existed was a very thin, highly uneven patchwork of local public health initiatives.
So it depended heavily on where you lived.
Entirely. If you lived in a wealthy metropolitan area like New York or Chicago, you might have access to municipal clinics or charity hospitals. But if you lived in a rural area or a severely economically depressed region in the Deep South or Appalachia,
Let me guess, there was nothing.
effectively nothing. Public health was a luxury many local governments simply could not afford.
The sources actually mention counties where people had never seen a doctor, let alone a public health clinic.
Yeah, totally isolated.
So when the WPA hires these out-of-work nurses and tells them to go practice nursing, they are essentially airdropping medical infrastructure into healthcare deserts.
That's a great way to put it.
But how did they practically do it? I mean, a nurse still needs syringes, vaccines, and a sterile environment. They can't just operate out of their car.
The improvisation was incredible. They partnered with local health boards, much like these school lunch partnerships. Local doctors would sometimes donate supplies, or the WPA would use a portion of federal relief funds to procure vaccines.
And where did they set up shop?
They set up clinics in repurposed spaces, church basements, empty storefronts, or unused schoolrooms. And from these improvised hubs, they ran massive immunization drives against diseases like diphtheria, typhoid, and whooping cough.
Now, I know there's a historical caveat here from our dossiers that we need to address.
Right, the terminology.
Yeah. When we call the WPA the first national social welfare agency, we are using a specific framing because they weren't the only game in town during the New Deal.
No, it is a very important distinction for historical accuracy. Calling them the first national social welfare agency is a descriptive framing of what they actually did on the ground, not their legal statutory status.
Right, because there was actual welfare legislation passed.
Exactly. The monumental Social Security Act of 1935 is what created the formal legal welfare mechanisms:
Hmm.
unemployment insurance, old age pensions, and aid to dependent children.
So Social Security was the legal welfare state being born?
Yes, but Social Security was primarily a system of cash transfers?
They mailed a check.
Right. The WPA was the first national agency that was actively delivering broad, varied social services directly on the ground, face-to-face with the citizens.
Ah, I see the distinction. Social Security mailed a check, but the WPA swabbed an arm, administered a vaccine, and checked a child for malnutrition.
Exactly. The WPA was the physical presence of care.
And the dossiers make it clear that to a rural family living in a town with no doctor who is bringing their child to a WPA clinic to get their very first immunization against a deadly disease, that bureaucratic distinction does not matter one single bit.
Not at all. To that family, the federal government is providing life-saving health care. The mechanism of how the nurse's paycheck is categorized in a ledger in D.C., whether as work relief or welfare, is completely irrelevant.
The tangible outcome is what matters.
The outcome is what matters.
The outcome is a healthier child who doesn't die as a preventable disease. And when you extrapolate that out, you start to see the profound long-term health impacts this accidental program had on an entire generation of American children.
We are talking about raising the baseline of childhood health across the country.
Right. The compounding effects are immense.
They are. If you take a child and provide them with consistent daily nutrition through a WPA hot lunch, and you provide them with early cognitive development in a WPA nursery school, and you protect them from infectious diseases through a WPA immunization drive,
you are fundamentally altering the trajectory of that child's life.
you are building a stronger, healthier citizen from the ground up.
And you are doing it in communities that historically had been entirely left to fend for themselves. The WPA flattened the curve of inequality regarding basic human care simply because the unemployed caregivers were geographically distributed all over the country.
That geographic distribution meant that the relief went exactly where it was needed most. It bypassed the traditional institutional gatekeepers.
It is just wild to think that this was essentially a side effect of trying to fix the unemployment rate.
A massive structural side effect.
But if you have a child who is now fed and immunized and cared for, you've met the prerequisites for the next major hurdle in a person's development.
Education.
Exactly. The WPA had taken care of the body. Now they had to figure out what to do with the out-of-work professionals who were trained to feed the mind.
Which leads us to another major pillar of the WPA's hidden welfare state: education and access to information. Because again, the recurring pattern dictates the outcome.
Right. The WPA looked at the relief roles and saw teachers.
But not just early childhood teachers. They saw high school teachers, college instructors, people who deeply understood pedagogy.
And just like you can't hand a nurse a shovel, you can't just tell a high school literature teacher to go pave a road.
Right.
So what was the specific task they assigned them?
They assigned them the task of teaching the most basic, consequential, and empowering skill a person can possess: reading.
Adult literacy.
Yes. The WPA expanded massively into adult education and literacy classes.
The archives I reviewed really highlight how systemic illiteracy was in the 1930s. We aren't just talking about a few people who fell through the cracks.
Yeah, it was widespread.
There were large swaths of the adult population, particularly in rural areas, among marginalized communities facing Jim Crow segregation, and among immigrant populations in cities who had never had access to formal education.
It was a massive structural deficit.
So the WPA took these unemployed teachers and put them in community halls, church basements, or schoolrooms at night.
And the pedagogy was incredibly practical. They weren't teaching abstract literature to these adults.
What were they teaching?
They were teaching them how to read a newspaper, how to decipher a basic contract, how to sign their own names instead of making a mark.
Wow. Just the fundamental tools of participating in society.
Exactly. They taught tens of thousands of Americans how to read and write, which fundamentally altered their economic viability.
But they didn't stop at teaching people to read, because once you know how to read, you need books.
Naturally.
And the WPA found another highly specific group of professionals on the relief rolls: librarians.
And if you have unemployed librarians,
you naturally get libraries.
But the logistical challenge there is immense. You cannot just build a massive stone library in every single tiny rural town in America.
Right. It's too expensive and it takes too long.
So what did they do?
The solution they came up with is one of the most fascinating pieces of this entire history. I want to spend some time on the library extension services and specifically the Packhorse Librarians of Appalachia.
Oh, the Packhorse Librarians. It is a remarkable testament to the lengths the WPA would go to deliver services.
The dossiers on this are absolutely captivating. Eleanor Roosevelt was a huge champion of this specific program.
She was very involved in pushing these rural initiatives.
Right, so you had regions in eastern Kentucky and the Appalachian Mountains where there were no roads, let alone libraries. So the WPA hired local women, paid them roughly $28 a month, and these women would saddle up horses or mules.
Mules, horses, whatever could make the trek.
Exactly. They would load up saddlebags with books and ride 100 to 120 miles a week up dry creek beds, over freezing mountain passes, just to deliver books to isolated cabins and rural schools.
The physical endurance required for that job was staggering. They were navigating treacherous terrain in all weather conditions to bring literature to people who had literally never held a book before.
And what I found amazing in the archives is that when the books inevitably wore out or when they didn't have enough books to meet the demand, these librarians would create scrapbooks.
Scrapbooks.
Yeah, they would cut out recipes, quilt patterns, local news clippings, and paste them into binders, creating their own hyperlocal reading materials to circulate.
That level of ingenuity demonstrates how deeply these workers cared about the mission.
They weren't just punching a clock.
No, not at all. They weren't just punching a clock for a federal check. They recognized the profound cultural starvation in these areas and took it upon themselves to cure it.
And in areas that were slightly more accessible, the same impulse birthed the modern bookmobile.
Oh, the bookmobiles.
Yeah. The WPA mobilized vehicles, sometimes specially designed trucks, sometimes just modified cars, and sent them into rural communities and small towns that had absolutely no library at all.
It was revolutionary for those towns.
It's like turning a delivery truck into a portal to the rest of the world. Imagine living in a town where the only books were a family Bible and maybe an old almanac.
And suddenly,
Once a week, a truck rolls into the town square driven by a WPA librarian, and the back opens up, and it is full of novels, histories, encyclopedias, children's books.
it completely shattered the geographic isolation of these communities. It integrated them into the broader cultural and intellectual life of the nation.
And alongside the librarians, the WPA also hired recreation leaders, right?
Yes. They found people on the rolls who knew how to organize community theater, sports leagues, arts and crafts in parks and playgrounds.
So they're not just delivering books, they are delivering culture, recreation, and community cohesion. They are building the social fabric of these towns.
And if we look at the underlying pattern again,
Oh.
skill on the rolls plus a matching task equals a service delivered that the federal government had never provided directly before.
It really is a formula.
It is. The adult literacy classes, the bookmobiles, the park programs, these laid the absolute foundations for the modern community education and outreach programs we see in libraries and parks departments everywhere today.
I think we need to talk about literacy and library access not just as a nice cultural bonus, but as a structural social safety net in their own right.
That's a very important way to frame it.
Because if you teach an adult to read, you are empowering them to participate in the economy in a completely different way. You are giving them the ability to read an employment contract without being exploited, to apply for a different kind of job, to understand the news, to participate in democracy.
It's the ultimate economic tool.
Right. That economic and social empowerment directly benefits their families and their children. It is a protective measure against poverty.
By distributing that tool via unemployed teachers, the WPA was structurally combating the very poverty that created the need for the relief rolls in the first place. It was a cyclical intervention.
It is just this massive, flourishing, interconnected ecosystem of care. You have the hot lunches giving immediate caloric energy to the children. You have the shadow clinics preventing disease and treating malnutrition. You have the literacy classes opening up economic pathways for the parents. You have the bookmobiles delivering the world to your doorstep.
And it was all built by accident.
Simply by refusing to let talented people sit idle.
It is a profound testament to the latent potential within the American workforce. When you match idle talent with unmet community needs, the results are deeply transformative.
But there is a catch to all of this.
There usually is.
There's always a catch when we deal with emergency legislation. This entire miraculous ecosystem of care is predicated on one thing: a massive economic depression.
The labor surplus.
Exactly. The only reason the WPA has this army of cooks and nurses and teachers at its disposal is because they can't find jobs in the private sector. So what happens to this entire infrastructure of care when the very thing that created it, the lack of jobs, suddenly disappears.
That brings us to the liquidation phase of the WPA, which officially culminated in 1943.
Right in the middle of World War II.
Exactly. The wartime economy was a completely different beast than the Depression economy. Factories were running around the clock to produce munitions, ships, aircraft,
The war machine was humming.
and millions of men have been drafted into the armed services. So the massive labor surplus that defined the 1930s vanished almost overnight, replaced by an acute labor shortage.
So the private sector, or at least the defense sector, suddenly absorbs all those unemployed workers. The WPA cooks go work in military mess halls or defense plant cafeterias where they can make significantly more money.
Right. The nurses are desperately needed in military hospitals.
And the teachers go back to schools or take administrative jobs in the war effort.
Consequently, the WPA was officially liquidated, effective June 30, 1943. But this created an immediate existential crisis for the services they had built over the previous 8 years.
Because the funding vanished.
The federal funding for the labor dried up because the workers were no longer considered in need of relief. When the WPA lost its labor force, the school lunch program, the rural clinics, the bookmobiles, they all lost the very people who were making them run.
So what happened to the school cafeterias? Did the local boards of education just shut the doors, turn off the stoves, and say, well, it was nice while it lasted, back to bringing a cold potato in a tin pail?
That is the pivotal transition moment in this history, because the country had experienced the undeniable benefits of this accidental welfare state.
You can't put the genie back in the bottle.
I really can't. The communities, the teachers, the parents. They had seen what a hot lunch did for a child's ability to learn, to grow, to stay healthy. They couldn't unsee it.
Right.
And while the immediate wartime period was chaotic and local districts scrambled to fill the gaps, often relying on volunteers or local funding, the idea did not die with the WPA.
The proof of concept had already been established on a massive scale.
And that proof of concept culminated shortly after the war in 1946, when Congress officially established the National School Lunch Program.
The NSLP, the exact program that subsidizes school lunches in America to this very day.
The 1946 Act made permanent and national bare the very idea that the WPA had proven at a necessity. The WPA school lunch program is the direct institutional heir, the principal ancestor of the cafeteria programs used in almost every public school today.
I want to make sure we honor the multi-causal reality of history here, as the dossiers point out. The 1946 National School Lunch Act was the direct descendant of the WPA's operational blueprint, but it was also heavily driven by other systemic factors.
Right, definitely. Agricultural policy played a huge role. During the war, the government had gotten very good at managing agricultural surpluses.
So they needed somewhere for that food to go.
Exactly. The permanent school lunch program was seen, in part, as a mechanism to absorb surplus commodities from American farmers, keeping post-war crop prices stable.
And there was a military component too, wasn't there?
Yes. There were intense wartime nutrition concerns that, frankly, terrified military brass. General Hershey, who ran the Selective Service, reported that a disturbing number of draftees were rejected due to physical ailments directly related to childhood malnutrition.
So they were trying to draft guys to fight in WWII, and they were too sickly because they hadn't eaten well during the Depression.
Exactly. The government realized, in a very stark way, that national security relied on a well-fed populace.
It's a fascinating convergence of interests. The farm economy needs price stability, the military needs healthy recruits, and the children need food.
It was a perfect storm for legislation.
But the operational blueprint, the physical mechanics of how the federal government could and should partner with local schools to feed kids every day without overstepping jurisdictional boundaries, that DNA comes straight from the WPA cooks.
Unquestionably. The WPA was the laboratory where the mechanics of federal food assistance for children were invented, negotiated, and stress-tested on a massive scale.
So what does this all mean for us today? We started this deep dive talking about a child with a tray and a WPA worker with a ladle in 1936. We followed that ladle through 500 million meals, into shadow health clinics, onto horses carrying books through Appalachia, and finally into an act of Congress in 1946. What is the ultimate takeaway from this historical surprise?
The overarching takeaway is about how crises can radically reveal the structural gaps in our society. Before the Depression, it was easy for the government to ignore rural malnutrition or illiteracy.
But the crisis made it visible.
Exactly. But more importantly, it shows how the improvised, emergent solutions to those crises, when driven by the actual skills of the people on the ground, can become the bedrock of our permanent institutions.
And it brings us to this concept of the infinite dividend.
The infinite dividend.
Yeah, we talk about government dividends all the time as physical things. If the WPA builds a road, the dividend is that your town gets to drive on it for 50 years. If they build the Hoover Dam, you get electricity.
If they paint a mural in a post office, you get to look at it.
Right. Those are infrastructural, static dividends. But this dividend, this is something profoundly different. This is a biological, generational dividend. This is a dividend you can literally put on a cafeteria tray.
It is the most intimate, human-scale return on public investment imaginable.
Think about it. Every single time a child sits down in a public school cafeteria today and eats a subsidized hot lunch, they are drawing a direct, measurable dividend from a 1930s jobs program that simply decided that an unemployed cook deserved a paycheck.
It's a beautiful way to think about it.
The echoes of that one administrative decision regarding labor logistics are still feeding millions of children every single school day, nearly a century later.
From a desperate measure of economic work relief came a permanent structural pillar of American childhood.
So let's just briefly recap the incredible journey we've taken through these dossiers today.
Sure.
We started with a strict, seemingly dry, bureaucratic rule. Hire one person per needy household off the relief rolls to hit an employment quota. But because the unemployed are a cross-section of society, that rule revealed a hidden, desperate workforce of caregivers.
The nurses, the teachers, the cooks, the librarians.
And by refusing to waste their specific professional skills, the WPA accidentally birthed an entire ecosystem of care. We're talking about roughly 500 million hot meals, rural clinics where none had ever existed, adult literacy classes that transformed local economies, and bookmobiles reaching the most isolated towns in the country.
And when the Depression ended and the WPA was liquidated to feed the war machine, the country realized it couldn't let the kids go hungry again.
Leading directly to the National School Lunch Program of 1946. It is the story of how an accident of labor logistics created the nation's first major social safety net.
And looking at how that historical accident played out, this raises an important, deeply relevant question for us today.
What's that?
Well, the entire premise of the WPA's accidental welfare state was matching unused, idle skills to desperate community needs. A massive economic crisis accidentally revealed that our communities were starved for basic care, and putting unemployed caregivers to work solved it.
Right.
So if we look around at our own communities today, what untapped skills and hidden talents are sitting idle right now?
That's a great question.
What abilities are just waiting to be matched with today's unmet human needs if we only had the structural imagination to connect them?
Wow, that is an incredibly profound thought to sit with. If we could harness that exact same logic today without needing a Great Depression to force our hand, what kind of care could we deliver? I want to thank you, the listener, for joining us on this deep dive into the archives. The next time you walk past your local school cafeteria or see a community bookmobile parked at a local festival, I hope you look at them with a completely new sense of history. Because you aren't just looking at a lunch line or a truck full of books, you are looking at the enduring legacy of an accidental welfare state and a dividend that is still paying out one hot meal at a time.